From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The people of Afghanistan need a lifeline. After decades of war, suffering and insecurity, they face perhaps their most perilous hour.
A month after the Taliban seized power in Afghanistan, we look at why many in the Afghan countryside have hopes the withdrawal of U.S. troops will finally end decades of violence. We'll go to Kabul to speak with Anand Gopal about his New Yorker article, The Other Afghan Women. Then, as the debate over booster vaccine shots heats up in the United States, that's a third shot, calls are growing for global vaccine equity.
With less than 1% of global doses administered in low-income countries, the scale of injustice and the level of urgency is obvious. This is one of the great geopolitical issues in our time.
Finally, El Salvador has become the first country in the world to recognize Bitcoin as legal tender.
The protest that took place in San Salvador and across the country show that common Salvadoran people do not want Bitcoin as legal tender, and that they see through Bitcoin as bad economic policy, as a ploy for money laundering and corruption.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States reported nearly 2,600 COVID-19 deaths Wednesday as the official U.S. death toll passed 666,000, or two-thirds of a million people. Officially, 1 out of every 500 U.S. residents have died of a coronavirus infection since the start of the pandemic. Scientists at the Food and Drug Administration have expressed skepticism over a push by the White House to authorize third booster doses of Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine. An assessment by FDA staff released Wednesday found vaccines currently in use in the U.S. still afford protection against severe disease and death. The World Health Organization's called for a global moratorium on booster shots through the end of the year, as many low-income nations have been unable to acquire vaccines for more than a tiny fraction of their populations. Meanwhile, the Biden administration will make COVID-19 vaccines mandatory for all new immigrants to the United States beginning October 1st. The U.S. already requires immigrants to be vaccinated against hepatitis, measles, mumps, polio, and rubella. Pope Francis called Wednesday on Catholics worldwide to get vaccinated against COVID-19 in an apparent rebuke to a U.S. cardinal who was hospitalized with the disease after anti-vaccination comments. Cardinal Raymond Leo Burke, who's in his early 70s, was hospitalized with severe COVID-19 in August and placed on a ventilator. He survived, but now faces an intensive rehabilitation. Cardinal Burke previously called vaccines totalitarian and repeated a conspiracy theory that COVID vaccines carry hidden microchips. Speaking to journalists aboard a return flight to Rome Wednesday, Pope Francis rejected anti-vaccine sentiment and said getting a shot is an act of love.
It is a bit strange because humanity has a history of friendship with vaccines. As children, we were vaccinated for measles, polio. All the children were vaccinated and no one protested.
A warning to our audience, these next stories contain descriptions of sexual violence. Some of gymnastics' biggest stars offered a scathing account of the FBI's failure to stop serial sexual abuser USA Gymnastics Dr. Larry Nassar during testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee Wednesday. This is Olympic gold medalist Michaela Maroney.
This was very clear, cookie-cutter pedophilia and abuse. And this is important because I told the FBI all of this, and they chose to falsify my report and to not only minimize my abuse, but silence me yet again. I thought, given the severity of this situation, that they would act quickly for the sake of protecting other girls. But instead, it took them 14 months to report anything when Larry Nassar, in my opinion, should have been in jail that day. The FBI, USOC, and USAG sat idly by as dozens of girls and women continued to be molested by Larry Nassar.
Simone Biles, the four-time Olympic gold medalist, widely considered to be the greatest gymnast of all time, also spoke before the Senate.
I don't want another young gymnast, Olympic athlete, or any individual to experience the horror that I and hundreds of others have endured before, during, and continuing to this day in the wake of the Larry Nassar abuse. To be clear, sorry.
Take your time.
To be clear, I blame Larry Nassar, and I also blame an entire system that enabled and perpetrated his abuse.
Lawyers say that in the time between the FBI being told of Dr. Nassar's crimes and his 2016 arrest, Nassar abused another 120 people. FBI Director Christopher Wray apologized to the gymnast during the hearing. Last week, the FBI fired an agent involved in the investigation into Nassar. Both the gymnasts and senators on the Judiciary Committee called out Justice Department leadership for failing to appear at Wednesday's hearing. Attorney General Merrick Garland is expected to testify in October. Here in New York, as the federal trial for accused sexual predator and trafficker R. Kelly continues, a survivor and former backup dancer told the court earlier this week she saw Kelly engaged in a, quote, sexual situation with rising R&B superstar Aaliyah when she was just 13 or 14 years old. Kelly and Aaliyah were married in 1994 using falsified documents when Aaliyah was only 15 and Kelly 27. R. Kelly faces multiple federal criminal charges, including sexual exploitation of children, kidnapping, and forced labor. In China, a leading figure in the country's Me Too movement says she'll appeal her case after a judge dismissed her sexual assault and harassment claims. Zhou Xiaoshuan, a former television intern, accused a well-known host of forcibly kissing and groping her in his dressing room, but says the court refused to consider key evidence in her case. She addressed the court's decision.
I don't know if I still have the courage to stick with it for another 3 years, so I don't know if this time will be a farewell. But if it is a farewell, then it's really disappointing to have to say that I or we have failed like this.
The International Criminal Court said Wednesday it'll open a full investigation into possible crimes against humanity committed as part of Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte's brutal war on drugs. After weighing evidence on more than 200 victims, the ICC's judges found evidence that a, quote, widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population took place, unquote, and that Philippine authorities, quote, failed to take meaningful steps to investigate or prosecute the killings. Last year, a United Nations report found at least 8,600 people have been killed in the drug war unleashed by Duterte, with some estimates suggesting the true toll could be 3 times higher. Brazil's Supreme Court has delayed a decision on a case that could determine if thousands of indigenous people can reclaim stolen ancestral lands. The move by Brazil's High Court to indefinitely suspend a ruling came after thousands of indigenous people representing 176 groups camped out in the capital, Brasilia, to condemn the destruction of the Amazon rainforest and the genocide of indigenous peoples. The White House said Wednesday the U.S. will share nuclear submarine technology with Australia in a new trilateral military partnership. The coalition is known as AUKUS, short for Australia, United Kingdom, and United States. Its formation comes as President Biden continues to pressure U.S. allies to take a more aggressive military posture toward China. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson joined the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison and President Biden at a virtual summit Wednesday.
And the first task of this partnership will be to help Australia acquire a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, emphasising, of course, that the submarines in question will be powered by nuclear reactors, not armed with nuclear weapons. And our work will be fully in line with our non-proliferation obligations.
The U.S., UK, and China are among the 9 nations known to possess nuclear weapons. None of them have signed or ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Neither has Australia, which says it supports the retention and potential use of U.S. nuclear weapons on its behalf. The White House said President Biden has complete confidence in U.S. General Mark Milley Wednesday, following reports he circumvented the official chain of command in order to prevent possible actions from former President Trump. A new book by Washington Post journalists Bob Woodward and Robert Costa says Milley called his Chinese counterpart twice, as well as U.S. military officials, as he feared Trump, who he believed was in mental decline, could start a war with China. According to the book, Milley also told senior officers he should be involved in any attempt to launch a nuclear weapon, that all decisions had to go through him. Milley was reportedly motivated in large part by a phone call with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who called Trump crazy and asked what measures are available to stop him from launching a war on or nuclear weapons. The Justice Department says it'll ban federal law enforcement officers from using chokeholds during arrests and will bar no-knock entries while executing warrants except in rare cases. The change in policy came as former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, who was convicted of murdering George Floyd, is scheduled to be arraigned today in separate federal civil rights case. An indictment by a federal grand jury found evidence that in 2017, Chauvin held a 14-year-old boy by the throat, hit him in the head with a flashlight, and held his knee on the boy's neck and upper back while he was prone in handcuffs and not resisting. The encounter left the boy bleeding from his ears and needing 2 stitches. And the city of Philadelphia will pay $2 million to Rakia Young, a black mother who was attacked by a horde of police officers and separated from her young child in October last year. Young was driving past an anti-police brutality protest when the assault took place. Critics say the settlement, which comes from taxpayer dollars, does nothing to hold the Philadelphia police accountable for their brutal attack. To see our interview with Rakia Young's lawyer, go to democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Nermeen Sheikh. We're both in New York. Hi, Nermeen.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, we begin today's show looking at Afghanistan, a month after the Taliban seized power. The New York Times is reporting there's been a dramatic drop in violence in the Afghan countryside following the Taliban takeover and the U.S. withdrawal of troops. One doctor in Wardak province reports his hospital has no patients with conflict-related injuries for the first time in over 2 decades. But the hospital is in a crisis as it is unable to pay salaries or buy new medical equipment. On Wednesday, United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres warned Afghanistan is facing a dramatic humanitarian crisis and urged foreign governments and institutions to keep supporting the people of Afghanistan. UNICEF has warned 1 million Afghan children are at risk of starvation. We go now to the capital, to Kabul, where we're joined by Anand Gopal. His latest article, The Other Afghan Women, appears in The New Yorker. It's based on his deep reporting in the rural villages of Afghanistan that have been devastated by decades of war. Anand Gopal is also the author of No Good Men Among the Living, America, the Taliban, and the War Through Afghan Eyes. Anand, thanks so much for joining us. Can you talk about who the other Afghan women are?
Thanks, Amy. When we were watching the images streaming from Kabul of people desperately trying to get to the airport, including many of my friends, it was easy to come to the conclusion that perhaps what was happening right now was the worst thing that had happened in the last 2 decades. And of course, there were many Afghans who wanted to get out because they desperately want a better life. And I don't blame them for that. There was another reality actually at the same time that wasn't really covered as much. And that was happening outside of Kabul in rural areas where for the bulk of the last 20 years, the war was actually being fought. So we think of the war in Afghanistan as just happening in Afghanistan, but actually it wasn't fought in most of the country. There was only particular provinces where the fighting was happening. So I visited Helmand province in southern Afghanistan, which is really the epicenter of the violence for the last 2 decades. And I wanted to see how women there who had been facing roadside bombs and night raids and airstrikes, what they thought about the U.S. withdrawal. So that's the other Afghan women in the title. And so the piece is actually about trying to get their views of how they looked at the American withdrawal after 2 decades.
And Anand Gopal, just to make clear, over 70% of Afghanistan's population is rural. So we have, in a sense, a highly distorted view because we hear about urban areas, and in fact, not just urban areas, only Kabul or principally Kabul. Now, among the people that you spoke to in one village, Pan Kile, a woman told you that a large number of her family, all civilians, had been killed in the last years, and you went and spoke to many other families in the village and found that on average, every family had lost 10 to 12 family members during the war that they refer to as the American War. Could you elaborate on what they told you?
Sure. So the woman in question, her name is Shakira, and she's a housewife who lives in a very small village in the valley of Sangin, which was one of the areas of the most intense violence over the years. And so I had the opportunity to meet her and interview her a number of times. And, you know, I'm somebody who's been covering this conflict for many years, and even I was taken aback by the sheer level of violence that people like her had gone through and had witnessed. So she lost, as you said, 16 members of her family. But what was remarkable or astonishing about this was that this wasn't in one airstrike or in one mass casualty incident. This was in 14 or 15 different incidents over 20 years. So there was one cousin who was carrying a hot plate for cooking and that hot plate was mistaken for an IED, a roadside bomb, and he was killed. There was another cousin who was a farmer who was in the fields and had encountered a coalition patrol, and he was shot dead. Shakira told me his body was just left there like an animal. So there was so many different instances. So people were reliving tragedy again and again. And it wasn't just Shakira, because I was interested after interviewing her to see how representative this was. So I managed to talk to over a dozen families. I got the names of the people who were killed. I tried to triangulate that information with death certificates and other eyewitnesses. And so the level of human loss was really extraordinary. And most of these deaths were never recorded. It's usually the big airstrikes that make the media, because in these areas, there's not a lot of internet penetration. There's no media there. And so a lot of the smaller deaths of ones and twos don't get recorded. And so I think we've grossly undercounted the number of civilians who've died in this war.
And Anand, one of the other women that you spoke to, Pazaro, said to you, they're giving rights to Kabul women and they're killing women here. Is this justice? She said. I mean, in a sense, as you show in this piece, the other Afghan women, there are two different realities in Afghanistan. There are probably more, but with respect to the attitude towards the Taliban taking over the country. Could you talk about that? You've covered, of course, as you said, the war extensively over many, many years from Kabul as well as elsewhere across the country.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about women's rights in Afghanistan, we tend to think about the ability to go to school, to work, to have representation in parliament. And these are real gains that were made in the last 20 years. But there are other women's rights that aren't talked about. So when I asked Azaro or other women, you know, what do you think about the claim that the U.S. was bringing women's rights to Afghanistan? They told me, you know, we can't walk outside without worrying if we're going to get blown up. So what right how is that protecting our rights? It's also a part of women's rights to be able to walk without fear, to be able to live as a women's right? So they had a very different conception of women's rights, which was not that they rejected the aspiration for wanting to get educated or to wanting to have a public role, but they also didn't want to be shot at or have their loved ones killed. And so they had a very different conception. And so when I asked them about the claim that the U.S. was bringing women's rights, they're very skeptical and many of them were cursing the United States, saying they brought us nothing. So, for example, like one person said, they were bringing rights to Kabul and they were just bombing us here, essentially. So it's a country that has different realities, and I think we need to be able to hold both of those realities in our head at the same time.
Anand Gopal, if you can talk about the empowering of warlords by the U.S. occupation. If you can tell us the story of Mir Dado and take that right through to a person who ended up at Guantanamo.
So Mir Dado was a member of the Mujahideen, which was the the holy warriors or the rebels, the rural rebels that were fighting against the Soviet occupation. The Soviet occupation was a brutal occupation that killed millions of people in Afghanistan, and so naturally people are rising up against it. But at the same time, some of these rebels were being supported by Pakistan, by Saudi Arabia, and especially by the CIA. And so there was the creation of warlords or strongmen. There was never warlords in Afghan history until the start of the wars in 1979. So Amir Dado is one of these warlords, and he came to prominence in the Sangin Valley in the mid-'80s. He was a major drug trafficker. He was also somebody who held a religious court, and he basically acted the way we think the Taliban would act now. You know, he would make sure women stayed in the home. When people tried to marry for love, he would have them arrested. He kidnapped people. I mean, he was really considered a real brutal strongman. When the Taliban emerged in the mid-'90s, the main reason they emerged was to fight against people like Amir Dado. So they came to the Sangin Valley in Helmand in early 1995, and they demobilized him, and he fled the country. And then for the next few years, the Sangin Valley and places in southern Afghanistan were at peace. And so that was the kind of perspective that a lot of the women there had, which is that they don't like the Taliban, but they hated the warlords. And so at least the warlords are gone, and they would accept that. Then when the U.S. invaded in 2001, they did something astonishing, which is that they brought those very same warlords back into the country. You know, they had a choice there. They could have, you know, tried to support local Afghans. They could have tried to help build a democracy with the incredible yearning there is in Afghanistan for a better world. I mean, people like Shakira, the woman I profile in the piece, she wanted the U.S. to invade. She hated the Taliban, and she wanted to support. Instead, what the U.S. did is they brought people like Amir Dado back into the country. The reason they did that is because the U.S. never really cared about building a democracy in Afghanistan. The mission was always about counterterrorism. It was always about trying to find quote-unquote bad guys. And so they brought these warlords back in who could be their partners. And so for the next 2 or 3 years, from 2001 until 2004, Amir Dado basically terrorized the Helmand countryside. Hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people, innocent people were arrested. People were killed. There's the multiple cases of people who were wrongfully accused of being Taliban members and sent to Guantanamo. There was essentially a one-sided war that was waged by the U.S. and its allied warlords like Amir Dado against the Afghan population in Helmand. And that ultimately is what led to the reconstitution of the Taliban by 2004.
I mean, you talk about Amir Dado suspected of being responsible for the killing of U.S. Staff Sergeant Jacob Frazier and Sergeant Orlando Morales in March of 2003, but he managed to point the finger at a Taliban member who ended up being sent to Guantanamo.
Yeah, I mean, this is an example of the extraordinary, chaos that was happening there, and the ways in which the strongmen were using their access to the Americans to eliminate their enemies. So what happened in this case was that the U.S. Special Forces went to meet some members of the Afghan government in Sangin, and Amir Dado, who was a U.S. ally, engineered an attack, an ambush on U.S. troops. It killed 2 U.S. soldiers, Special Forces personnel. They were the first 2 U.S. soldiers who died in Helmand as a result of violent activity. And the U.S. themselves, internally among the Special Forces, began to suspect that their own ally, Amir Dado, was the one who was behind the attack. Nonetheless, Amir Dado took some random guy who was had nothing to do with the attack, who was an ex-Taliban who had surrendered and was sitting at home, took him, tortured him, and then delivered him to the U.S. and said, this guy here is the person who is the real culprit. The U.S. sent him to Guantanamo. He spent 3 or 4 years in Guantanamo. And when I looked at the classified documents from Guantanamo, which were eventually released by WikiLeaks, what was extraordinary in those documents was that the investigating judges and others knew that this person was innocent. They wrote in the documents that Amir Dado, the U.S. ally, was the one who actually conducted this ambush. But nonetheless, this person languished in Guantanamo for 3 or 4 years. His case is not unique. This has happened hundreds of times across the country in those years.
And Anand, as you've pointed out in a recent interview with Reveal News, one of the effects of the way in which the U.S. supported these warlords and made them extremely wealthy is that they had an incentive to continue the war and an incentive to continue producing terrorists. Now, you mentioned earlier that Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, Pakistan in particular, played a critical role in supporting the Mujahideen during the Soviet occupation. Could you say more about the role of Pakistan in supporting the Taliban all of these years, and what role you think the country will play, Pakistan will play, in the interim government, its relations to the people who have been appointed in the interim government by the Taliban?
Well, Pakistan supports the Taliban very closely. A number of the senior leaders of the Taliban were living in Pakistan, so the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence agency, was basically sheltering the senior Taliban leadership. There's a very close working relationship there. But it's very important to understand the history here, which is that in 2001, when the U.S. invaded, the Taliban was defeated. To a man, they basically either surrendered or, escaped and ran away. So there was, in 2002, no Taliban in Afghanistan. There was no resistance whatsoever. Al-Qaeda as well fled the country. They went mostly to Pakistan and some of them to Iran. So you had thousands of U.S. troops on the ground in 2002 with a mandate to fight a war against terror, but with no enemy actually to fight. And so this was the context in which they began to incentivize their allied warlords to basically produce bad guys and enemies for them. They started to arrest these people, kill them. This created the insurgency. Once the insurgency was created, and this is now 2004, then Pakistan got involved and tried to influence the insurgency for its own interests. Its own interest is it basically views Afghanistan as its own backyard and doesn't want Indian influence. And so Pakistan's role in Afghanistan has been a very malign role, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the ultimate cause of the war in Afghanistan was by the U.S., its actions in the early years.
I wanted to ask you about a part of the article that hasn't gotten very much attention. Anand, you tweeted, CIA-created Afghan death squads were evacuated before many American citizens. Can you explain?
So from the very beginning, the U.S. created these militias. And as I mentioned earlier, warlordism and militias, that's not something that's natural to Afghanistan. It really emerged in the late 70s, early 80s as a result of the war. In 2001, the U.S. really invented some of these, created some of these groups. So there's a group called the Coast Protection Force, which was a CIA-created militia in the southeast of the country. There's many groups like this around the country, and they were seen as the CIA's closest allies in trying to fight the Taliban. And many, many innocent people, many, many civilians were suffered as a result of this. And so their methods were seen as extraordinarily brutal. What happened with the evacuation last month was that these CIA death squads were essentially the ones that were one of the guards of the airport itself. And the reason they were there is ultimately they were going to be evacuated as well. And it was a horrific scene as I was talking to colleagues and friends who were on the ground. Sometimes these death squads are shooting at crowds. Also, the Taliban wasn't always letting people through. It was chaotic. But ultimately, all of these death squads got evacuated. There are still American citizens here in Afghanistan today trying to get out. But the CIA militias are all out. They're now living in the United States. And it's not the first time this has happened. There have been other CIA-backed strongmen who have been living comfortably in the U.S. for the last decade or 2 decades. And so this is kind of, I think, an indictment on what the CIA's priorities are in terms of Afghan lives.
And Anand, before we conclude, if you could comment on the people the Taliban has appointed to serve in the interim government. You've said that what's striking in the list is that the most powerful members of the Taliban, those who were running the insurgency in the last 20 years, have been excluded. What are the implications of this? You've said that this might create a shadow government.
Yeah, I think that, when we see the Taliban cabinet that was announced a few days ago, I mean, all of those figures in the cabinet were held similar positions in the 90s. But the powerful people in the movement, some of them were military commanders, others do have cabinet positions, but they all kind of exist in what's called a shura, leadership shura, which is in Kandahar. That's really who's controlling the country. There's a prime minister. He's a longtime member of the Taliban, but I'm not sure how much power he actually has. the real power is behind the scenes. And I think that's tragic for Afghans because that means even less accountability. The previous regime that was here for 20 years had very little accountability. There was elections, but those elections were mostly rigged. And a lot of the real decision-making was done behind the scenes. And I think there were some Afghans who were hoping that this would be a change. I think this is not going to be a change. It's going to be further down the line of zero accountability and power being wielded behind the scenes.
Finally, I wanted to ask you, main issue that you write about is the countryside versus Kabul. We know a lot more about what's happening in Kabul. You write the Taliban takeover has restored order to the conservative countryside while plunging the comparatively liberal streets of Kabul into fear and hopelessness. Can you end with that?
Well, there's activists, women's rights activists, people part of civil society, et cetera, all of which only appeared in the last 2 decades and only appeared because of the American occupation. And for people like that, this obviously is they're facing despair, and it's very understandable. Many of them have been able to leave the country. Many are still stuck here in Kabul. And Kabul is a relatively liberal area compared to the countryside. And there are more freedoms for women here than there are in places like Helmand, where I visited. And the idea that the Taliban are going to impose the mores of Helmand onto Kabul, I think, is a tragedy because it means that people who've enjoyed some freedoms for the last 2 decades are going to see them rolled back. All of this, I think, didn't have to be this way. The U.S. had the opportunity in the early years to negotiate with the Taliban when they were much weaker. They had the opportunity to try to create an inclusive government. But instead, they chose the path of war. And here's where we are now. Nobody's really won from this. The people in the countryside are breathing a sigh of relief because there's no war. But the people in the cities are terrified. Nobody's actually happy with the outcome. And that's a tragedy.
Anand Gopal, I want to thank you so much for being with us, journalist and professor at Arizona State University. His article, The Other Afghan Women, is in the New Yorker magazine. We'll link to it at democracynow.org. He is also author of the book No Good Men Among the Living, America, the Taliban, and the War Through Afghan Eyes. Coming up is the debate over a booster vaccine shot. A third shot heats up in the U.S. Calls are growing for global vaccine equity. Stay with us.
وحيدة ما يدرى بها الزمن الشجر جف لما اتهلك الجذع تشقق واتكسر وين يا وطن وين يا زمن غضبان من سنين تتمطى وتفلك في جبينك بالألم وين يا وطن وين يا زمن غضبان من سنين
by Alsara and the Nubatones. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. As the United States marks a deadly milestone, 1 in every 500 residents has died of COVID. Scientists at the Food and Drug Administration have expressed skepticism over a push by the White House to authorize third booster doses of Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine. An FDA committee meets Friday to discuss the need for vaccine booster shots. This comes as health leaders have issued an urgent call for global cooperation on vaccine supply and access to end the worst pandemic in the last 100 years. WHO Director General Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus said Tuesday vaccination rates on the African continent are far below the WHO's target for 70% of the population of all countries to be vaccinated by mid-2022.
So far, just 2 countries in Africa have reached the 40% target, the lowest of any region. As I said last week, that's not because African countries don't have the capacity or experience to roll out vaccines. It's because they have been left behind by the rest of the world. More than 5.7 billion doses have been administered globally, but only 2% of those have been administered in Africa. This leaves people at high risk of disease and death, exposed to a deadly virus against which many other people around the world enjoy protection.
This comes as heads of state are set to attend the UN General Assembly next week. And on Wednesday, President Joe Biden will host a virtual global COVID-19 summit to, quote, call on chiefs of state, heads of government and international organizations, business, philanthropic and non-governmental leaders to come together to commit to ending the COVID-19 pandemic. For more, we're joined by two guests. In Johannesburg, South Africa, Zane Dangor is with us, special advisor to South Africa's foreign minister. During an event Tuesday hosted by Public Citizen, he called on the U.S. to come up with a proposal for allowing other countries to manufacture vaccines. Also with us, Dr. Joya Mukherjee, infectious disease specialist, associate professor of global health at Harvard Medical School, and chief medical officer for Partners in Health. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Zane Dangor, we want to start with you in Johannesburg. You have this big debate brewing in the United States. In fact, on the front page of the New York Times today, U.S. booster policy is in flux as dissent mounts. Apparently, top people at the FDA are quitting over the push for booster shots. We have that, while you have the rest of the world, some countries barely having access to a vaccine. South Africa and India have been on the forefront of demanding that the large vaccine companies like Moderna and Pfizer share their recipes and technology to allow other drug companies to be able to make these vaccines available to everyone. Explain what you're proposing and your view of this debate over a third shot for U.S. residents.
So on the first one, South Africa and India in October of 2020 made a proposal at the World Trade Organization for certain provisions of the trade-related aspects of international of property rights to be waived for the duration of the pandemic. So it's a temporary call for a waiver on IP rights and exclusive use to allow for what is called idle capacity in other parts of the world to be given the technology and know-how, the recipe, as you called it, to manufacture more life-saving medications, including vaccines, so that a more efficient response to the pandemic is possible. This proposal has been been supported by over 130 countries, and since May of 2021, also supported by the U.S. through President Biden's announcement and the administration's support for the initiative in Geneva. This proposal does not, change the international property rights regime. It basically just calls for changes to the manner in which companies can license it.
We hear you fine.
Companies can access the licenses and the know-how to ensure that we do reach the target of 10%, by the end of September, and 40% of the global population by the end of this year, and 70% by the end of 2022. As of now, the major blocks to this process is the fact that the European Union is not supportive of it. And that is very significant in the context of the WTO, as the European Union speaks on behalf of all European countries at the WTO. And we're hoping that President Biden and others could use the summit this week to persuade more members to support it, the waiver, in particular the European Union. With regards to the booster shots, I also co-chair the Vaccine Manufacturing Working Group, which is linked to the World Health Organization. And we've been discussing the movement in high-income countries towards booster shots and the impacts of that. There are two. The one is that it will continue the skewed distribution of vaccines, where you have most of the high-income countries almost completely fully vaccinated or have reached their targets towards population immunity, whereas countries in Africa, their percentage is less than 3%. There's another component to this, is that the pressure on the materials used to manufacture vaccines comes under pressure. So the kind of glass vials that vaccines are packaged in will come under pressure with the calls for booster shots, because booster shots lend themselves to single use of these glass vials. So there's quite a bit of in terms of the value chain that comes under pressure. Secondly, the WHO itself, the chief scientists of the WHO and others have actually expressed the view, based on evidence, that the science is not completely behind the need for booster shots yet. So if the science is not behind the need for booster shots, then the risks associated in moving towards this, in terms of continued skewed access, the potential for new variants to emerge when you have large numbers of the world's population unvaccinated, needs to be evaluated by the US and other countries that are thinking about moving towards the use of booster shots. Booster shots is a euphemism for third and fourth doses. So you're moving towards third and fourth doses in some cases, when in many parts of the world people haven't had access to the first dose of a vaccine. Thanks.
Zindango, also just to be clear, it's less than 1% of people in low-income countries who've been fully vaccinated, and as you said, 3% on the continent of Africa. Now, South Africa already has a technology transfer hub in place. Could you explain what's happening there and what needs to be done to increase manufacturing capacity?
So one of the first hubs, it's the first global hubs to be established for mRNA research. And this hub was established as part of the initiative from the WHO, and after a robust call for interest, South Africa was chosen as the first of these hubs. mRNA technology was the chosen technology in the first instance because it lends itself to rapid scaling up of manufacturing. And this is why it's called an mRNA hub. But we might move towards other technologies, and the WHO can speak on that with a lot more eloquence. But the challenge we have is that the late-stage technology holders, the rights holders for late-stage technology, which is the proven technology, which is at this stage, your Pfizer and Moderna's have decided not to cooperate with the WHO in supporting the hubs through technology transfer. And this delays the process, which means that South Africa will either have to use unproven technology or invest in its own mRNA technology. But this is the idea of this hub is that it will become a training hub. So the companies involved, which are both located in Cape Town, the one who would be investing in training the first spoke, which is the first South African company that will distribute it, but will also be able to train other hubs and manufacturers across Africa. And as we heard yesterday from some of the leaders on this initiative, it may even be able to train manufacturers in other parts of the world, in the global south as well. So the hub is one of the key measures, and not just the South African hub, but other hubs across the world, is that you're not going to get security of supply for this pandemic and following pandemics if we don't change the economics of life-saving medication. And that is where it's produced and where it's consumed. So Africa, only produces 10% of the vaccines that they consume, and none of the vaccines related to COVID. There's fill and finish capacities across Africa, but none, none that can actually produce the vaccine using the active pharmaceutical ingredients. So this is the idea of the hub. It's really to change the asymmetrical nature of vaccine and other life-saving medication, the manner in which it's produced and how it actually gets distributed. Because the lessons from this pandemic is only if you've got regional security of supply will everybody access these life-saving medications equally.
Dr. Joya Mukherjee, you've called the idea of third booster shots here a terrible idea morally. What do you think the U.S. needs to do to boost vaccine supply? And what would you like to see happen at Biden's summit next week?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Amy and Narmeen, for having us on. And it's a pleasure, again, to speak with Mr. Dongor on the same show. You know, we were very happy that the Biden administration was willing to waive the TRIPS, the intellectual property, in this limited way. Yet that is a tiny step in the cascade that we are demanding. So first is getting actual agreements written with the WTO, with the manufacturers, so that the technology can be transferred and those patent waivers mean something. That's really important. There is still no formal language, and we're demanding that. The second, though, is money. There is no way to massively scale up the manufacture of vaccines regionally, as Mr. Dongor has said, without a lot of money. And we need to think about this as a moment of global collaboration. To me, this is a test. Can we get 2 shots to the entire world? If we can't do that, we don't have a prayer at the collaboration needed for things like climate change. And this is an emergency that affects all of us because variants are coming from areas where there are large numbers of unvaccinated people. And so we need the leaders of the world to sit down and follow the lead of the Global South, leaders like the President Ramaphosa and others who have called for this now for months and months, since November and December, and we were told, well, it would take at least 6 months to do it. Well, had we started to transfer technology, invest in the supplies, invest in the training, in November, we would be manufacturing those vaccines now. So we're just livid at these small steps, because what we need is the patent waiver and the language. Then we need the transfer of technology that's written down and is happening. And then we need the funding to make this real. And if we don't do that, we are not going to get out of this. Right now, we're working on charity donations from this country or that country. It's not going to solve this giant public health crisis that affects all of us.
And what about Public Citizen's report that contends the Biden administration could unilaterally share the recipe for Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine with the world because it funded much of the research?
Absolutely. So the United States we have language in the law that says if the U.S. government has contributed monetarily to the development of a product, we can use it then in our national interest. And what we're asking President Biden to say is that vaccinating the world is in our moral interest, our global interest, but it's also in our national interest. The Delta variant that's spreading came from another country, a very a poorly vaccinated country, India. So, you know, this is all within the legal framework that's within the WTO. And what's creating this idea of booster shots being bad for the global South or impoverished countries is the scarcity that's created by greed and profit. Because if we had the money, we could make the vials. If we had the money, we could make the lipid nanoparticles. If we had the money, we could build the factories. So this really needs to be financed as war is financed, out of whole cloth. We cannot do this without really significantly ramping up. And we heard this in the AIDS crisis as well. We can't make the meds because the raw materials aren't there. It was all moot as soon as the money flowed.
Dr. Joya Mukherjee, we're going to talk more about this next week. Infectious disease specialist, associate professor of global health at Harvard Medical School, chief medical officer for Partners in Health. Thank you for joining us. And Zane Dengor, special advisor to South Africa's foreign minister, speaking to us from Johannesburg. Next up, we look at the first country in the world to recognize Bitcoin as legal tender. What does it mean? We'll look at El Salvador. Stay with us. Voices After the Fire by Las Musas Desconectadas. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. We turn to El Salvador, where thousands took to the streets Wednesday to protest President Nayib Bukele's growing consolidation of power and a new law making El Salvador the world's first country to recognize the highly volatile cryptocurrency Bitcoin as legal tender. Protesters in San Salvador condemn Bukele's plan.
They promised to do things differently, and they've been worse. We are here in the midst of the pandemic because this dictatorship is deadlier than the virus. We aren't going to stay home with our arms crossed because our parents and grandparents and uncles died for a country free of dictatorships and corruption. We are still seeing that. Now it is our turn to resist.
Protesters in El Salvador also criticizing the recent court ruling that paves the way for President Bukele to run for re-election in 2024. We're joined now by Jorge Cuellar. He's assistant professor at Dartmouth College. His forthcoming book, Everyday Life and Everyday Death in El Salvador. His latest article in the New Left Review is headlined Bitcoin Sanctuaries. Professor Cuellar, it's great to have you with us. Explain the significance. Why has El Salvador become the first country in the world to recognize Bitcoin as legal tender? What does it mean?
So the turn to Bitcoin, Amy, is actually quite a surprise to a lot of us. There's no reason why Bitcoin should be at the top of the government agenda in a moment of pandemic, of water stress, of food insecurity, of depressed wages. But the big sell by Bukele around Bitcoin has been that it will lessen remittance fees to the country. As you know, Salvadorans are one of the largest populations that remit money to El Salvador, which is a quarter of GDP. And so one of his arguments for the turn to Bitcoin has been to lessen those commissions that entities like Western Union or MoneyGram take on every remittance sent to the country. But as you can see, people are very suspicious of this. And in fact, it's been shown that those remittance commissions are actually higher in Bitcoin than they are with traditional wire transfer services.
Jorge Cuellar, could you also explain how this rollout has been problematic? There's the Chivo wallet. People in El Salvador have been offered an incentive of $30. But explain what's happened with the rollout and also the implications of numbers of people in the country who don't have access to cell phones to use the app, and what demographics, what groups in the country will be most at risk as a result of Bitcoin being used as legal tender?
Yes, so the rolling out of Bitcoin in El Salvador and using Chivo Wallet, this app that people can download from smartphone stores, has been very glitchy, has often been down for peak times during the day, and it's been a frustrating experience for many people who have tried to sign up and use it and experiment with the app. ATMs themselves have fallen all the time, repeatedly, leading to a lot of user frustration and showing that Bitcoin is not only an unstable currency, but even the infrastructure that El Salvador has very improvised up to the September 7th rollout has been very piecemeal and uneven. Right. And so what this has done, in effect, the $30 in Bitcoin that has incentivized folks to sign up has been something that many poor Salvadorans and common people are interested in. It functions as a kind of economic stimulus in times of pandemic. And so folks are very eager to sign up. But in fact, the system has been so erratic that it hasn't really worked. But what I'm seeing based on popular use is that people are signing up for the app, using getting their $30 that is offered by the government to sign up, and actually just withdrawing it. And so they're withdrawing it into U.S. dollars and going out to the restaurant and getting some food, buying some groceries, and actually just leaving the app to the side because, again, the recurrent suspicion of Bitcoin and Chivo Wallet, which is shrouded in so much ambiguity and lack of educational campaigns by the government to really tell people what Bitcoin is, what it means, how it impacts daily life, and how it sort of intersects with daily activity. And this has been one of the most challenging, or one of the most challenged sites where the social movements have drawn attention to Bitcoin as being more of a ploy for supporting illicit accumulation, narco money, money laundering, and for foreign investors who are the primary audience of Bitcoin to come into the country and invest and transform this kind of monopoly immaterial money into real estate, into business, into other forms of currency and wealth that is inaccessible in general to the common Salvadoran person.
Jorge, what are the environmental implications of Bitcoin, and how does it fit into the right-wing philosophy of President Bukele as he tries to consolidate power?
So the Bitcoin rollout actually comes after various constitutional moments of erosion where he stacked the Legislative Assembly, where he's dismissed magistrate and constitutional judges. So the Bitcoin project actually is shadowed by this kind of authoritarian consolidation, which has been part of his kind of command economy where he seems to be the one giving orders and everybody has to follow along. But in terms of the environmental implications of Bitcoin, it operates through computers and through high energy use. And so one of the big pitches that Bukele made initially to foreign investors to come and bring their Bitcoin to El Salvador was that they would offer cheap energy. And this cheap energy, Bukele claimed, was going to come from volcanic geothermal sites that he hopes to build around the country's volcanoes. Already, geothermal is used in El Salvador in very uneven ways, but he's trying to ramp this up, and this will have environmental impacts in the country, in a place that's extremely deforested, is living through high levels of water stress, and is part of the question of food scarcity that often drives things like migration. So Bitcoin is at the heart of ecological concerns for El Salvador.
We want to thank you for being with us, Jorge Cuellar, assistant professor at Dartmouth College. We'll link to your article in the New Left Review headlined Bitcoin Sanctuaries, his forthcoming book, Everyday Life and Everyday Death in El Salvador. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Messiah Rhodes, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Tarasena, Tammy Warrenoff, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Tamer Yastu, Joe John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, Adriana Contreras. Our general manager is Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Marion Barnard, Paul Powell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Grant, Dennis Moynihan, David Prude. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.